It's interesting to see this agenda being spoken about at a time of national health emergency when the economy is in such dire straits. Why is this so important for the government today? And in particular, what do you say to perhaps some of those conspiracy theorists out there who suggest that this is being put on the agenda today because the government is facing an election and these two things are linked? We need to have a fake news law in place because it's been suggested that it would be politically advantageous for the government. How do you respond to claims of that nature?
Well, I don't follow that logic. We invented this virus. We knew this virus was going to come when we put in the fake news, and we could use the virus as an excuse. In fact, when the fake news bill was being debated, the points we made were, one of the points we made were during a public health crisis, fake news could be circulated to spread panic and fear, and that wasn't a matter of imagination. It has happened elsewhere. Through using the modern means of communications, fake news has become something that's been industrialized and sent out to confuse people, to get people to believe in things which are not true, and to undermine societies. It's happening everywhere. And we decided we needed to counter it. And the best way of countering fake news is actually not censorship. It's to give more information. And so the design of our fake news law, which a lot of people don't acknowledge, the critics don't acknowledge because they don't want to acknowledge, is actually that the fake news is left there. It's on that platform, but the person who put it out has got to carry a correction to say that this is being considered to be false, and for the true facts go to such and such a place. And our point is, for those who believe in free speech, well, this is more speech. You read the fake stuff, you read the true stuff, or what we say is the true stuff, and you make up your mind.
Well, there's big companies like Facebook, which are operating here in Singapore. They say that this stifles freedom of expression. And at the same time, they've also criticised the government in some way for essentially saying that, look, when it comes to the enforcement of this fake news law, it comes back to the individual minister, not an independent body. Why is that the case? And shouldn't this be overseen by an independent body rather than government ministers who have their own Facebook pages and who manage their own PR?
Well, I can entirely understand Facebook being critical of this legislation, because Facebook has, with respect, been behind the curve on fake news and has had to apologize a number of times. For example, when Speaker of House Nancy Pelosi's a fake was put out of her speech, Facebook initially thought there was nothing wrong with it. When Sri Lanka wanted a certain page taken down, which was calling for Buddhists to kill Muslims, Facebook thought that that didn't contravene its standards. So I will be careful about government's sovereign right to protect the country's peace and security being dictated to by a company or companies whose primary goal, understandably, is to make money. And fake news travels, it virals, and it creates eyeballs, it gets eyeballs, and I can understand companies wanting that. How have we affected free speech? I ask Facebook, I ask others. How does the mechanism affect free speech? You've got the original stuff there, people put it up, they carry a clarification which gives them a link to a place that tells them what the facts are. Isn't that good for free speech? Second, this canard about ministers being the persons who decide. The ministers decide in the first place for reasons of urgency. But we've made the law such that anyone can challenge the minister's decision in court immediately and without cost. And the courts have heard cases, and they decide. They are the ultimate deciders of what is true and what is false. The minister takes the first decision.
Martin, come back on in here.
Yeah, Minister, I'm glad Dan brought up this issue of elections, which Singapore is facing. Constitutionally, you need to call them before April of next year, but historically, traditionally, what the government does is it prefers to call them early. Yesterday, a piece of legislation was tabled in Parliament called the COVID-19 Special Arrangements Bill, which is meant to implement temporary arrangements to ensure the safety of voters, candidates, also election officials, should the next general election take place amid the COVID-19 situation. So obviously this is something that the government is planning ahead for, as the Singapore government is very famous for doing. Can you explain a little bit more how an election, which is a huge logistical exercise, can be held safely in a situation where right now we have social distancing and, let's not mince words, we are in a lockdown?
Martin, the elections have to be held before April of next year, constitutionally, as you point out. Do we know, does anyone know whether this crisis will be over before April? We don't. And as a result, if you have to hold elections at a time when the crisis is not yet over, then you need to look at the law and make sure that elections legally are possible. That's what that bill does. It provides a framework legally, how voting can take place, how candidates can turn up, and what happens if they are in quarantine. So this is the thinking ahead part that you talked about. And we have to put it in place. Precisely how it is to be held, when it's to be held, that's a matter for the Prime Minister. I'm sure he will take into account the logistical issues, and you can assume that the Elections Department will make sure the logistics are taken care of. But in any event, the current circuit breaker mechanisms are for a month. The second reading of this bill can be no earlier than next month, and then it will come into force. So, you know, as many have speculated, it's unlikely that those provisions can apply if an election is called any earlier, and not many people assume that election is on the cards in the next few weeks.